My name is Cynthia Howke, and I'm on the professional staff of the Landmark Society of Western New York, which is an organization that has been around since 1937. Ironically, that this talk is here tonight because of the lady who lived in this house for over 97 years, Helen Ellwanger. She founded the Landmark Society in 1937 when a house in Cornhill was due to be demolished and a parking lot put in. This is way before many of us would ever dream that things like urban renewal of the 1950s. This was the Depression of the 1930s. So the fact that we're having this talk in Helen Ellwanger's home for many of her years, though she actually grew up next door in the brick house. That was her childhood home. This is all part of the Ellwanger, and we'll talk about that later, the Ellwanger estate and the bigger picture of horticulture in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So the slides that you're going to see tonight range in time from the late 19th century images to the present, so you can get maybe a larger picture of what we do at the Landmark Society, which is when we go into a neighborhood, it isn't, here's a big mansion, isn't that nice, but we really don't look at everything else. We look at the entire built environment, whether it's a modest cottage, a middle-sized vernacular house, or something large and more elaborate like the Patrick Barry house or the Ellwanger house that you're sitting in. So let's go and take a walk for about 200 years of the greater South Wedge neighborhood, because it does spill over to include, frankly, where you're sitting tonight, as far south as the cemetery and over to Highland Park. For those of you who have known the Landmark Society, we are on the west side of the river. This is our headquarters, 1840s house. It was vacant for 20 years. It is next door to the Campbell Whittlesey house, built in 1835, which is the reason we were founded, was to save that one building. But over time, we now extend our preservation planning services to a 9-county area. The city of Rochester is not a city on the lake. We were founded because of the river and the water power. You are sitting approximately 8 miles south of Lake Ontario. In Buffalo, I'd talk about the lake because City Hall is a stone's throw from Lake Erie. But the early settlers in the late 17 and early 1800s, they came here because land was cheap. This was the Wild West. We're not in Missouri, Texas, Montana, California. Where you're sitting took 30 days overland travel to get here before the Erie Canal opened. So this was western frontier between the 1780s and the 1820s. It was a very distant place. While the Hudson Valley had settlers going back to the 1600s, settlement for Europeans were really just starting in this area. And this is the kind of view they would have had: water power, waterfalls, and if you were the 19th century version of Donald Trump, your brain would have said, I can have mills, I can have water power, I can have a settlement and create businesses. And people will come here because the land's so cheap and it's very fertile. Here's downtown Rochester when we became a city of 300,000 people in the 19th century, and those waterfalls were no longer a wilderness view, but they were indeed an industrial base. But this industrial base would morph through time. We are in about our first reinvention of ourselves as a city. We started as the Flour City, F-L-O-U-R. We were a settlement of 3,000 people. The Erie Canal, which was literally 4 feet deep and 40 feet wide, is what opened. When they called it Clinton's Ditch, Governor Clinton, they weren't kidding. It was only a ditch. But it opens in between 1819 and 25, and that 30-day trip now to the western lands you can do in 4 days. And suddenly thousands of people, and within 10 years we have a city of 30,000 people, known as Rochester, New York, not a village called Rochesterville. And you have entrepreneurs, you have new settlers, mostly New Englanders, but it's surprising. Our city name came from Colonel Nathaniel Rochester, who was a slaveholder. He was a farmer, he was well-to-do, and he was from Maryland. He was a Southerner. So our downtown, when you see Main Street, is fairly wide when you look from one end. That is a Southern plan, a broad Main Street, and we had a courthouse square. We did not have a New England village green like you might see out in Leicester, New York, or over in Clyde, New York. So Southerners were our principal entrepreneurs and landowners for Rochester. He bought his land on the west side of the river, not where you are sitting. His land was in Genesee County. When other entrepreneurs came here on the east side, you are sitting in Ontario County until 1821 when Monroe counties formed. the opening of the canal initiates this enormous influx of new people. We see today, oh, Americans are so, they don't stay in one place. They're always traveling. You don't know your neighbors. If you read newspapers in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you'd see the exact same verbiage. We don't know our neighbors anymore. All these strange people coming to our community. Why, you can't leave the doors unlocked. So there was a lot of transience through here in that first half of the 19th century because of the Erie Canal. There were boat building yards in the South Wedge. When you are looking at different books, it's really weird to think that we had boat building industries. This is an ad from one of the city directories. There were boat building yards near the Strong Museum. There were boat building yards near the canal. The canal came through where you drove on the 490 expressway. That is the original Erie Canal path coming right through downtown Rochester. Where you see the Erie Canal today through Genesee Valley, that was Governor Teddy Roosevelt's project in the early 20th century when they moved much of the canal out of cities like downtown Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, because it was too small. They had to increase its size, and you couldn't do that through a huge city. So when I'm talking about the canal, I'm talking about north of here, where the Rundle Library and the Broad Street Bridge are. That is how the canal came into and through the city from the 1820s to the 1920s. There are canal structures. This is the oldest industrial building left in the city of Rochester. It has almost a twin on the west side. This is the beautiful 1822 stone warehouse at number 1 Mount Hope Avenue. It's now offices, but for many years it sat next to the canal, and even next to where you park behind it, there was a feeder canal, a small ditch of water that extended from this building all the way down to where the Elmwood Avenue Bridge is at U of R, bringing water from the Genesee River to help fill the canal. So that feeder canal or ditch was not for navigation, but it was to provide a water source to fill the canal. So this was at a great spot. It was near the river, and it was really built to be next to the canal. That's why it does not sit on the riverbank. The river was not used for navigation very much because you had waterfalls at Court Street Dam, you had waterfalls at High Falls, and then you had waterfalls up at the Driving Park Bridge. You cannot sail a boat from downtown Rochester out to the lake unless you haven't done your homework. So that was one reason the canal was very important, because we could get products east and west, but you still had a problem getting products from the canal up to the port of Shalott, because Shalott was a village. It was not part of the city until the early 20th century. Here is a typical building, and this is actually an image from the 1870s, and it shows the kind of commercial buildings that you'd see on places like South Avenue, whose original name was South St. Paul Street until 1900, when they just cut it into South Avenue. You would also see, this is monuments of gravestones, and there were also the Cheney Company, which made a lot of cast iron. You might have some Cheney. We were here yesterday, some S-H-O-R-E-R. Some of your significant cast iron storefronts here in the South Wedge are from the Shorer Company, which was a big industry. These cast iron makers, they were making all kinds of products. In the mid and later 19th century, they could ship them not only on the canal, but by rail. And you'll see these Rochester cast iron storefronts all throughout villages in central western New York. Now, wherever you have people living, obviously, there's a famous saying, there's nothing assured but death and taxes. And in 1838, the new city of Rochester, New York, had a cholera epidemic. And the tiny burial grounds that were down on Main Street, where the Monroe High School athletic field is, that was East Cemetery. Over where the Susan B. Anthony apartments and houses are on West Main, that was called West Cemetery. They had a real problem because of the enormous number of deaths of this cholera epidemic. The city fathers decided they needed a large burial ground, and they purchased 50 acres of land at a, quote, great distance from the city, and that was the opening of Mount Hope Cemetery, which eventually would have over 150 acres and over 300,000 burials. This is a very important historic property, not only locally, but regionally, and it is filling out application to become not just it's already listed in the National Register of Historic Places because of local significance, but we feel strongly this has national significance as a burial ground, as a recreation area, for its beautiful geography, for its outstanding architecturally designed buildings, the 2 chapels. This was the community's burial ground. It was also the community's picnic ground. There were no public parks. Municipal officials did not feel it was right to spend your tax dollars on recreation and parks. Until 1888, if you lived in the city and wanted a outdoor experience, trees, birds, something in nature, not a crowded city neighborhood, this is what your option was to bring a picnic, come out, see the family grave plots, and literally picnic at the cemetery. It was not considered sacrilegious. It was part of not only Rochester, but American culture. As part of that, some of these other lovely amenities were added to the burial grounds. The Florentine fountain, which has been restored, it's cast iron, very lovely, from the 19th century, as was this very decorative gazebo in a Moorish style. The gazebo was put there actually to just cover a fountain where you could get public drinking water when you came to visit. So this today has emerged with the Friends of Mount Hope and their tours somewhat in the same guise as it served in the early mid-19th century, as a hiking area, a picnic you might want to bring, and special events have even been held there. I grew up going to cemeteries. On Memorial Day, I knew we'd be going with my family out to Wayne County in Ontario, taking care of graves, and we would run all over the cemetery, go bird watching. We thought it was really great, and they had a hand pump that still works today where you can pump water, which was really exciting to city kids. We never thought of cemeteries as spooky places. We thought of them as fabulous outdoor repositories of history and architecture. And it's very interesting to bring school children to this cemetery who have never visited a cemetery, and they have some pretty interesting reactions sometimes because they haven't been introduced to visiting a cemetery, often because they don't live in a community where any of their families are buried. But these are wonderful outdoor classrooms for anyone, whether or not they have family members there or not. Here in the South Wedge, you were an agricultural community. Surprising as it may seem, Averill Avenue's first name was Munger Street, M-U-N-G-E-R. And where you are now along the Genesee River from Ford Street North, they've torn down some of the 1960s apartment buildings and they're going to build a new. That was Lyman Munger's farm until the later 19th century, when it became warehouses and other industrial uses. But that was originally farmland along that eastern bank of the Genesee River. And so you still have some of the farm residences intact in the neighborhood. Probably the loveliest and one of the oldest is this Greek Revival farmhouse, which is just 2 doors south of here at the corner of McLean Street and was a residence till just a few years ago. It's now law offices, but this is one of the earliest houses in the neighborhood. Likewise, because you were somewhat removed coming out South Avenue, which was the main north-south entry into the city, you also had the opportunity to set up the public institutions for the have-nots in society. Not only in Rochester, but in many other communities. I could show you something similar, for instance, in Geneseo, New York, or Wyoming County, where you now go to Highland Park Extension and where the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is between Highland and Elmwood. This is where we had the county poorhouse, the county hospital for the poor, the insane asylum, the orphanage, and the county penitentiary, where the Al Siegel Center is today. Some of us are old enough that we remember seeing the psychiatric center, or as some of an earlier generation called it, the insane asylum, patients sitting rocking on porches behind fencing, chain link fencing. As a child, I always knew when we would come up Elmwood Avenue and stop at the light, you'd see a lot of elderly people rocking out on the porches of the buildings where now the Al Siegel Center, a new building, is. These buildings existed till the 1960s, and the longest serving one I'll show you later was the penitentiary. When an inmate was able to take a teaspoon and dig his way out of the brick walls, they decided security was an issue. And they built the new jail downtown. But this was typical. These were the have-nots of society. They had to be close enough that you could get water, and much of that was farmland even into the 1960s. Many of us remember seeing the farming. And one of the biggest surprises was in creating that southern extension of Highland Park, the over 700 burials that were discovered in the region near the Vietnam Memorial, where those who had been at the poorhouse didn't even get a grave or a marker at Mount Hope. They were simply interred at the poorhouse penitentiary campus. A city needs water, and one of the earliest civil engineering projects was to lay the enormous pipeline from Hemlock Lake up to what became Highland Park. This predates Highland Park, the establishment of the city's first reservoir that you see here in a turn-of-the-century colored postcard from about 1910. So that was a major piece of the neighborhood's history, was establishing this gravity feed, because Hemlock Lake is higher, gravity feed through many miles of pipe to Highland, where you're now undergoing a very interesting renovation with putting a new liner in the reservoir. The reservoir up at Cobb's Hill did not happen until about 1908. That was a second construction about 50 years after Highland Park's reservoir. FLOUR, flour, wheat growing, moves to the Midwest, and by the mid-19th century, our excellent climate for growing things takes over, and we become the horticulture or flower, FLOWER, city. Now, that's really a misnomer, because a lot of our horticultural activities were not the pretty petunias or geraniums you put in your yard. There were shrubs, there were trees, there were fruit. These were products that were being shipped to other parts of the country that were exploding with development, because now the railroad lines are succeeding the slow-moving canal boats as our main point of transportation. This lovely, almost painterly view, it's almost an idyllic view of the part of the 600 acres of the Ellwanger and Berry Nursery Company. Mr. Ellwanger was German, was 21, trained in Germany. Patrick Berry, an Irish immigrant, they met. They started their company in the early 1840s. It would become, quote, the greatest nursery in America. There were many other nurseries. Frost Avenue in Rochester, the Frost Nursery. Vic Park A and B, the Vic Brothers, the Vic Nurseries. Crossman Terrace, Crossman Nursery. So there were many others, but this was the one with the greatest renown. They lived at the office right here where you sit. Here's the Ellwanger house that George bought, a farmhouse, and enlarged it, renovated it once, renovated it twice. Rosemary's probably the fourth go-round of renovation and addition, where his partner across the street's house looks exactly the way it did, except for having indoor plumbing and electricity, in 1857. It is a remarkable ensemble of buildings that I, as a child, had only seen a few times because my parents usually drove that way. We didn't come this way on Mount Hope. And I knew I had seen these really unusual buildings, but no one had ever told me where they were or exactly what they were all about. This is an office building. It looks like a romantic castle built in the mid-19th century by one of America's greatest architects, Alexander Jackson Davis, out of New York City. It's the only Davis building in central western New York. I think he did a castle-style house in Syracuse, but that was demolished about 40 years ago. This is a remarkable piece of architecture from this era when you're looking to Europe and sort of Romantic and Walter Scott and all of these revivals. This is Gothic revival. Today, the University of Rochester owns it, but up until about 1920, it served as the office for the Ellwanger and Berry Nursery, or the Mount Hope Pomological Gardens, as they were called. You came out here to shop. How did you get here from downtown? Same company laid out the trolley, horse-drawn trolleys. By the mid-1860s, it was the Ellwanger and Berry Company. The horse-drawn trolley started at this gate across the street, went downtown to the Four Corners, and then north to Maplewood, where they had a beer garden, also owned by the Ellwanger and Berry Company. So they were pretty smart. Not only were they putting in this trolley, the horse-drawn streetcar, for the benefit of an expanding city, because that's how cities really expanded, was the extension of trolley lines, first horse-drawn and then electrical. They were putting in these trolleys so you could come shopping at their nurseries, and it certainly helped you get to Mount Hope Cemetery. The huge German immigrant influx in the mid-late 19th century, and today there are more German people in the United States of German descent than any other single group. How many Germanic folks do we have sitting in the audience? That gives you some idea. Somewhere in there, German, Austrian, Switzerland, or if you came before Germany was created in 1871, you might be Bavarian or Prussian or from one of the principalities. A lot of the Germans had very specific skills. My great-great-grandfather was a boot and shoemaker, and another one was a mason. But a number of Germans started our famous lithograph industry in Rochester. Stecker Lithograph is a beautiful building, still in existence. It's now up near the railroad station and been renovated for a restaurant and other uses. But here is the type of printing that these horticulture industries, these nurseries could have right here. I put a pear in Beverly because we have the pears out in the garden. But this is what you would have seen if you got catalogs. You didn't see photographs or line drawings. You saw these exquisite renderings of fruit, flowers. This is what you opened. And what the Ellwanger and Berry Nursery Company pioneered was something we take for granted today. They said, if you buy it, we'll ship it, and we guarantee it will get there living and viable. That was quite a claim if you were using the rail lines or ships. For instance, across the street were 6 acres of greenhouses, and under those greenhouses, they had many plants, among them citrus. And some of the first orange trees that went to California came from Rochester, New York. We don't think of this as a citrus climate, but you could grow them under greenhouses. They would ship them by boat down the Atlantic coast, over the Isthmus of Panama by land, there was no canal, and then by ship up the Pacific coast. So this was the renowned industry, not only in Rochester, but throughout New York. If you central and western, if you went out to Geneva, New York, William Smith College, part of Hobart, the Smith family had a major nursery business. So this was a big thing, and it all vanished. When we see Kodak going through dramatic changes, those of us that study history, we're not surprised. We've seen it before. But many of us have not lived long enough to see these dramatic. We don't run around and say, biggest employer in Monroe County is flour milling. That hasn't happened for over 100 years. The biggest employer in Monroe County are the horticulture industries. Nope, not anymore. Now they're a historic footnote. Here's Patrick Barry's house. He hired Gervase Wheeler, a noted English architect. This is in just about every architectural book in America. This is one of the premier examples of Italian villa architecture. Beautiful design. Patrick and his wife raised their children there. Their daughter, Harriet, lived there till the early 1950s. When she died, she was in her 90s, and it went to the University of Rochester, who now have faculty members. I think the provost is now living there again. But a remarkable house. Very little altered. The interior still has original furniture and drapes. And this is before the current, this was the first renovation of the house when the U of R acquired it. It is a remarkable and really nationally significant piece of residential design from the 1850s. Across the street, here is an earlier shot from the 1960s of the house you are sitting in. Off to the left with the double-arched windows is part of that farmhouse that was on this site that was later, over 2 or 3 renovations, expanded. Rosemary's porch is the third porch. There was at one point, we have a picture of a 2-story portico on the front of the house with big square columns that was removed during an early 20th century renovation when the current porch was added. Here is a former view. This was taken in 1982 when Miss Ellwanger had just passed away. This is the Ellwanger furnishings here in the living room, and you can see a lot of the bookcases and other dark trim that have survived beautifully in the room that you're sitting in right now. This, though, is not the only Ellwanger property. Next door, built in the 1870s, was a house where Helen Ellwanger and her sister grew up. When they moved into this house, Miss Ellwanger did not want people living next door. So from the 1930s to the 1970s, that was a vacant house, the haunted house sort of in the neighborhood. She had a little 20-watt bulb and a lamp on the second floor front window to try to make people think that somebody was living there. And many people over the years would call the Landmark Society and say, we're really interested in that house at 609 Mount Hope Avenue. And we'd have to tell them, well, that's not going to be for sale for a long time. The owner lives next door, and she really does not want to have any occupants. That did change, and it was rehabilitated in the early 1980s. The Ellwanger and Berry Company were very savvy entrepreneurs. They understood that the city was growing, so as an offshoot of their nursery, they started the Ellwanger and Berry Realty Company, and their first showcase houses were the ones across the street. Here is one of them. This used to be the home of the retired principal Marie Daly, for many decades. These were architect by design by A.J. Warner, and this was now they were starting to sell houses, and they took some of their 600 acres of land and they created streets that you should easily be able to figure out which ones they are because they're named for trees, Cypress Street and Linden Street. So when you look at names of streets in many communities, they'll give you an interesting entree as to their history and background. Here's a stereo view from the 1880s, and this is a classic view of any residential street here in Rochester, New York. We know this is Rochester, but we're not exactly sure what neighborhood. But it shows you before city zoning. Zoning is a phenomena of the 1920s. Here's how a typical neighborhood would be built. Closely spaced houses, no driveways because you didn't have cars. You had service alleys to the rear of for deliveries, horse-drawn wagons, and you had, sometimes you would have wood plank sidewalks, you might have gas lighting. Here in South Wedge, you had some houses that are from this era. This is on Gregory Street. It's one of the oldest houses dating back to probably the 1840s. It's a wonderful Gothic revival style cottage, and it still has its decorative woodwork along the front as well as pointed arch woodwork under the front windows. This is a remarkable and very important house, but you tend to not see it because it's set up and back from the road when you're, I think it's about opposite School 13, so you would see it on Gregory. It's a very early building. Now, some of the woodwork that was available, and much of this was through catalogs, just like we get things today. Here's another type of housing design, very appropriate to the South Wedge. And I'm doing a lot of research now, and I'm amazed I'm coming across newspaper articles. We often think of architects just doing expensive houses for the upper crust and those who own buildings. But when I've been looking at these 1880 articles, it's amazing where architects are being hired. And I have a notebook from one architect, Otto Block, and he has pictures of a street like this in there with little tiny sticks of trees. And he's obviously, this is one of his building projects in a vernacular neighborhood with very simple middle-sized houses. Rochester, for any of you that have moved here from other communities, we don't have row houses like in Brooklyn or Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore or any seacoast. We never had many row houses, and we certainly didn't have whole neighborhoods full of them. They're very rare. Even the most modest of citizen was living mostly in a single family dwelling. There's some great examples on Gregory Street of one-story shotgun cottages that were very modest, but you still had your own home. But though you probably rented, because before World War II, most people did still live in rent. We didn't have the wide ownership that we have today. And here's one of the most interesting houses, very similar to the photograph I just showed you from the 1880s, beautiful cut stone lintels over the windows, decorative woodwork in the front gable. And this is on Gregory Street. It's one of the most elegant houses in the neighborhood. And it also shows that we had mostly wood houses. If you had enough money to build a brick house, you were probably doing better financially. There were some row houses built in Rochester in the late 19th century. Here it is, the Green Monster, as it was called for many years. I wanted to show those of you who don't know the neighborhood too well where you've come from in just the past barely 2 decades. This is now beautifully rehabilitated. It's in the French Second Empire style. That roof at the top is called a mansard roof. And here you have what many cities have by the dozens and dozens, and it's not a big deal. This is a very rare example of this kind of housing in the city of Rochester, and it was one of the first buildings to be renovated during the current South Wedge renovation. There's some lovely buildings that were stores with cast iron storefronts. This is also on Gregory Street to show you the kind of scale and quality of building materials. Again, we had a lot of masons in the community. We had the building trades available to us as we are now in the city of Rochester going into our industrial phase of the 1880s and 90s. You have buildings that along any city arterial, Lyle Avenue, Lake Avenue, Monroe Avenue, South Avenue, Clinton Avenue, where you would have the village, your neighborhood shopping district. You walked from your house and you went to a meat market. You went to a bakery. You went to a grocery store. Grocery meant something very specific. It did not mean the meat market, and it did not mean baked goods. And those of you who are old enough remember this phenomena because it continues up into the 1940s, even the 1950s. This is the kind of building typical of those major neighborhood arterials where you might have been the baker on the first floor and your family lived upstairs, the old living over the store. This is a very elegant building, and at the top we know that a German carver, Mr. Hallstrick, carved those very interesting figures that you see at the top, decorative pediment on the front. Here's Old House Parts, before it became Old House Parts, a remarkable building that many of us do not know of anything else like this in the city. It was built as a residence originally. It's very elegant. It most likely had an architect, and it's thrilling to see that it did not go the way of the building to the left, which was demolished, that this was, even though it looked pretty sad, was renovated for use as a retail outlet, though originally this was a residence, a very interesting piece of design. You had schools in the neighborhood, and this is School 28. Those of you that know School 28 over on Humboldt Street, that's the new location. Here is School 28 from the 1880s, renovated, one of the first projects here in the neighborhood. It was renovated as apartments in the 1980s, but this is the kind of typical school building you would have had. As an elementary school in the 19th century, you might have had 600 to 700 children crammed in this building. There are a lot of stories of the overcrowded conditions of elementary schools. It was a very different era. You were lucky in the 1800s if you went through 8th grade. Then you certainly, in most cases, would have then gone into some kind of trade or would have worked, because even a 9th grade education was exotic. And in 1870s to 1901, we only had one high school for the whole city, and that was the Board of Ed at the Free Academy downtown. So very few students went beyond a 7th or 8th grade education. This was their major education in an elementary school. Certainly religion is a major part of any American community. Here in this neighborhood, you have a remarkable religious building constructed by one of the top names in American architecture, the Upjohn family out of New York City. This is this is an Upjohn design. It was built as I've just blanked. Thank you. It's Calvary St. Andrews. This is St. Andrews Episcopal Church. It merged later with Calvary Presbyterian Church. But you're looking at the campus of a very elegant Gothic Revival style church and education wing, beautiful woodwork, and its history not only for its renown as an piece of architecture design, but for its most famous pastor, Reverend Algernon Crapsey, one of the few pastors who was tried for heresy. But he was a social activist, and this building across the street was the headquarters. This was part of the church campus, and it was a headquarters for many different social outreach programs, including the first kindergarten in the city. It was not at a public school. It was here at this building, which was renovated into apartments in the 1980s. Reverend Crapsey's daughter, Adelaide, was a nationally known poet. Sadly, she died in her late 30s of tuberculosis. They are all buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. In the 1870s, the United States celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1876, and a lot of communities decided it was time to publish their history, because now they had a history. They had been around more than a few years. And Monroe County published a large book celebrating the county. You could be in the book. All you had to do was buy a page, and you could have your house sketched and show off to all your friends, relatives, and people you had never met that you had made it in the world of business and agriculture. This is a typical print from that 1870 history of Monroe County. It shows one of the cleanest farm sites I've ever seen. Manure is missing, and there aren't any. Some of these that do show farms, they'll have a major sketch of the current house and then a little sketch of a log cabin up to top to show just how far that family has come to be successful. You'll look at the tower of this building, which is not in the city of Rochester, because the county villages and towns are represented in the book as well as city, but you bought this. You had to buy the page, so sometimes some of the most prominent people in the community don't necessarily have pictures of their houses or factories in this book. But now you start to have towers appearing on many buildings. In the South Wedge, this is a lovely renovation of a French Second Empire design from the 1870s with that mansard roof, a very handsome tower, although it's of quite modest scale. The most whimsical of this kind of design of Second Empire is this house with a tower that's kind of hard to describe, but it's hard to describe because when architects and builders create, they really don't care that we can put them in a category 50 or 100 years later. This is artwork. This is what the client asked for. They may not have been working with an architect. They may have opened a book with patterns in it from New York City or Philadelphia and said to their builder, see that drawing on page 29? That's what I want. And it might have been a design by a Boston architect, but they never were getting royalties from this. You simply had to buy these pattern books. We still have them today. When you go to Barnes & Noble, you can buy, 500 plans for ranch houses over 3,000 square feet. This is the continuation of these pattern books of the 19th century. So we don't know who designed this or where the idea came from, but there was a skilled woodworker, and this is on Averill Avenue, on the south side of Averill, just east of Mount Hope. But it's a remarkable house that we don't know a similar one in the not just the city but in the region. I've been looking at buildings now for 3 decades, and I don't know of another one that looks like this. It's a really remarkable, very elegant design. And you could take older buildings and remodel them. And here is a tiny house, probably from the 1840s, and some owner in the 1890s or 80s wanted a modern tower. So they put this tower on, and that's very typical. Think of all of your families or relatives who have put family rooms on as additions in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s on older buildings. We get to the later 19th century, and we're getting a lot of more elegance. This is on Alexander Street, a beautiful house with wrought iron cresting on the roof and Italianate-style porch posts on the first floor. We had older houses in the neighborhood. This is on Gregory Street, where they took a simple mid-19th century cottage, and somebody had some money and decided they would like a porch, so they added a porch in the Italianate style. What surprises probably a lot of you, though there are some of you who do know a little, are actually in the design field, this porch is not bad. It's an addition. And some might say, if I bought that house, I'd get rid of the porch because it's not original. And I'd play devil's advocate, and I'd say, yes, it is. It's original to the 1880s or 90s. Oh, but it's not original. The house is older. And I would say, yes. But when we look at buildings, it's what is 50 or more years old is the criteria from the National Park Service. That's not my opinion. This is how we look at to determine historic significance. So here you have probably 1850s house with an 1880s porch. They are of equal importance, and if you ripped off that porch, you're actually diminishing the significance of this building. So don't go home and rip off your 1920s porch. If you have an 1880 building, it is now part of the evolution and design. And I said 50 years old. There's a few people in the room who may have exceeded their 50th birthday. This year, we are looking at the phrase historic building. Could be anything built 1960 or earlier. Now, I knew you'd either giggle, chuckle, or squirm in your seats, because history and looking at architecture of all types of buildings is a moving point in time. When I started at the Landmark Society, we looked at buildings built in 1926 and earlier. So that point in time has moved along. I am now looking at ranch houses, split levels, because I look and say, what do they represent? Post-World War II building boom. Mr. Ellwanger and Mr. Berry both offered 20 acres of land to the city of Rochester. The city fathers said, oh, I don't really think we want that. We don't spend taxpayer money on parks. They can go to Mount Hope Cemetery. Well, they started, evidently had second and third thoughts, and they finally accepted it. And Highland Park, with this initial donation, became the city's first established public park. For recreation, obviously, you could get there on the streetcar trolleys, even though it was kind of removed. And it became a horticulture center because many of the things in the park were already there because of it being part of the Ellwanger and Berry nursery grounds. This was exotic. This was, you worked 6 days a week. You had 1 day off, and this is even into the 1930s. Talk to some of your older relatives. They will tell you about working 6 days a week. You had 1 day off to have recreation. It was really exotic to come out to a park and just look at pretty things. That was your relaxing, because you could get there on the trolley. Most of you could not have afforded to own your own horse and buggy. So coming to a park for sheer beauty and outdoor and fresh air and recreation was a great novelty. And at the crown of the highest point in 1890, they opened the Children's Pavilion. It was donated to the city by George Ellwanger as in memory of his business Patrick Barry, and it existed into the 1960s. And it was one of the elements designed in this park by the great Frederick Law Olmsted, the first landscape architect in America, and of course the designer of Central Park in New York, but many other parks as well as park systems. The lilacs are just one of many stupendous scientific collections. I know we hear about lilacs all the time, but there are many other notable collections. The outstanding pinetum, all of our conifers from Asia, from North America. I think we have European conifers. And did you all know that the city's arboretum, or county arboretum, is not just Highland Park, but its sister park, Durand Eastman, is part of the scientific arboretum. When you go up to Durand Eastman, that was all leached out soil, farms that had been abandoned. Everything you see up in that park was planted. It was created as an arboretum. It wasn't wilderness. Wasn't it nice they didn't build here? If you see pictures, that was absolutely denuded land in the early 20th century. So Highland Park with Durand Eastman Park, which is actually in the city of Rochester. There's a little connective strip of land that's not in Arundecoit. It's a city park. These are the great scientific arboretums that are known not only nationally but internationally. So we're very lucky to have this resource. It includes the construction of the Lamberton Conservatory, named for one of the early founders, or I guess the first director of the park system, Alexander Lamberton. Construction and expansion continues. We had a couple of depressions, not just the 1930s, but 1873 panic, 1893 depression, sometimes worse than the 1930s. So there were some slowdowns of building in the 1890s, but here's a very interesting double house in the Queen Anne style that exists on Gregory Street and has been nicely renovated. When we first took a picture of this, it had asbestos siding all over it. So this was a really nice rehabilitation, one of the first in the neighborhood. Apartment house living is not something we had a lot of or were accustomed to, but this is one of the early apartment houses in any city neighborhood. Very handsome building with classical revival style porches. This is just off of Gregory. I think this is on Ashland Street, near former School 13. Likewise, if you have people living in places, you need fire departments. The Oddfellows Lodge for the city is now in this very interesting building, but this was originally built in the late 19th century as the neighborhood fire department. So you needed fire coverage for this era, and you had it. I apologize that this is so light, but this is one of the most interesting buildings that I just took our intern to see the other day. We have to remember that all these amenities we're taxed for are not something we've always had in our community. In the late 19th century, do you think we had community centers? No. Do you think we had recreation centers? No. What happens if you wanted a group of people that just wanted to get together? Well, maybe you could have a hall at the church, but if your church didn't support this kind of activity, you didn't have a place to meet. Do you think you could meet in public schools? Rarely. Where did you meet to have fun, to have a dance, to have a community gathering? Oftentimes, you had a citizen in the neighborhood who built a public hall. Mr. Weider, W-E-I-D-E-R, was a businessman. He was German. He had his fingers in many political pies, and he constructed this very handsome building on Gregory Street. The first floor was for retail. The second floor was residential. And those tall windows at the top was a ballroom, a meeting hall. There are buildings like this, the Towner Building, where Atlantic and University Avenue split. That's one. There was the Whaley Building, where Webster Avenue and Grand split. There were a number of these buildings that would have these upper level. If you were in a village like Avon, it'd probably be called the Opera House, but these were not opera houses. This was a gathering place where you could have social occasions, political occasions. You were not under the restrictions of a religious organization or the city government. You could have liquor here. That was one of the challenges of having public parks. Many of you who are from immigrant stock, most of us were at some point, if you came from Italy or Germany or France, or you had a tradition of when you went on a picnic, you had beer. You could not take liquor into the public parks. So there were private picnic grounds established like Corbett's Glen in Brighton. That was the reason for Corbett's Glen initially. You could go picnic and have beer and wine, but you could not go to Genesee Valley. You could not go to Highland Park. You could not go to Maplewood or Seneca. And that was the the immigrant culture versus the puritanical New England culture. I won't go off on that talk. But that was a factor in creating public and private picnic grounds, so that Bausch and Lomb, if they had their big industrial picnic, they did not go to Genesee Valley. They went to Corbett's Glen because they could have beer and wine. So that's a real interesting, some of the things I get to learn at Landmark, it's maybe kind of off the beaten track historically wise, but it makes my job very interesting. So here you have this public space that is now the Tango Cafe. Clearly this an architect designed it. We don't know who, but Mr. Weeder designed this so he could have his own hall for his own events under his sponsorship and was not subject to other people's rules. You had, for those of you who are senior citizens, too bad you didn't die early. And I don't mean that as a joke. There were no social services. There was no Social Security. Most people lived maybe into their 50s. If you were a senior citizen and you had no family, who was going to take care of you? The churches. The Episcopal home was the first nursing home facility, senior citizen facility, to be founded in the city by a religious organization. St. John's was founded by Salem's Church downtown. Then, of course, you had St. Anne's by the Catholic Diocese. You had the Presbyterian home, but this was the first religious organization to establish a old age home, as they called it at the time. And in the rebuilding in the 1970s, the chapel, which is the round section, those are the original stained glass windows from the first chapel that dates to the late 19th century. So what we take for granted today was something that the government did not expect to be paying for or responsible for. You either went to an old age home that was run by a religious organization, or if you were very lucky, a charitable organization. The Friendly Home out on East Avenue was called the Home for the Friendless. It was founded on East Avenue at Alexander, and it was basically for women who had no place to go. They didn't have relatives, they didn't have family, they didn't have children, and going to the Home for the Friendless didn't sound like a real great opportunity. So they changed it to Friendly Home, but I wanted to show you this because I wanted to show you the Episcopal home because that's very important in terms of the establishment of social services for the aged in the late 19th century. We had Frederick Law Olmsted, and now we do get a park system. We're one of only 4 communities in North America that have an entire park system designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. The other communities are Louisville, Kentucky, Chicago, Buffalo, and Boston. In fact, in Boston, it's called the Emerald Necklace, which we almost got here in Rochester, except those penny-pinching city fathers didn't want to pay for it. The 2 great parks that Olmsted designed that we have are Genesee Valley Park, which was in an English pastoral. It's very flat, these big open grassy areas. Yes, we used to play polo there. There's still a stable. If you've seen it with those little windows, that was for horses. The north end, he used the gorge to create a wilderness park. He made it look like it was wilderness, but those trees were planted in what you call Seneca and Maplewood parks. He also was to design, if you see the plans, there was to be a large park on the bluffs on the west side of Arundecoit Bay. That would have been the 3rd major park. And he was going to connect all of these green spaces, his necklace, by parkways, but they never were built, only in sections. So when you go on Seneca Parkway, Mount Read Boulevard, Genesee Valley Park, those wide sections, those were sections of the Olmsted Emerald Necklace that we were supposed to have, but only got parts of because of fiscal worries. One of the great under-recognized buildings in Genesee Valley Park, though, is the handsome clubhouse, which I know is architect design, and I would love to see restored because this is a lovely piece of colonial revival design with great arts and crafts. You go in and look kind of past the remodelings, but there are wall sconces and other original details. This building has such potential. It is a wonderful piece of early 20th century design that's really under the radar screen. So how many of you play golf? Well, if you go to the new or the old course, be sure to poke around this building. It is a very important piece of colonial revival architecture. The Barrys and the Ellwangers continued with later generations across the street. The same architect who did George Eastman's 1905 house, J. Foster Warner, created the William Barry House, which is now the home to the president of the University of Rochester. Likewise, the University of Rochester comes to your neck of the woods. For decades, it had been over where the Memorial Art Gallery. That's why we have College Avenue and University Avenue. People going to the University of Rochester up until the 1920s were not out here on the river. They were at University campus. That University Avenue was the only thing. If you were out here on the river, where the campus is today, you would have probably had quite a deep bank account, and you would have been playing at Oak Hill Country Club, because the river campus is the original Oak Hill Country Club. Before it moved to Pittsford, the deal was the university thought this would be a large parcel of land with great possibilities for expansion. Obviously, they didn't look at the river or the cemetery that was hemming them in. So what you see today as River Campus, created in the late 1920s, 30s, and right up to the present, is the original Oak Hill Country Club. So when you go across the river off of Genesee Street, you see a street called Oak Hill View. That's why it's called Oak Hill View. You were looking at Oak Hill Country Club. The early 20th century, that's why my job is fun. I grew up in Rochester, and I saw a lot of these street names, and I went past all these places, and now when I go by, I go, isn't it neat to know that this used to be Oak Hill Country Club, and now it's the U of R. It just makes it a lot more interesting, and it's a lot easier to remember your history when you're looking at visuals. Your neighborhood continues to develop. There's some interesting, more modernistic buildings. This is one of them. It's quite interesting. I don't know the designer's name, but it is one of the more notable early mid-20th century buildings, because for the most part, the South Wedge neighborhood was built up by about World War I. There certainly are buildings that come afterwards, but not many, because you didn't have too much more open space. We were very lucky to have one of the outstanding urban historians. In fact, the urban history field was created by, among others, Dr. Blake McKelvey, our legendary city historian who came to Rochester, wrote a 4-volume history of the city, which is a landmark in the world of urban history. And in the 1970s, for the U.S. bicentennial, he condensed those 4 volumes into this wonderful Rochester pictorial image, Panoramic History of Rochester, which is a great reference book to have to introduce yourself to the community. You had additional construction here in the mid-20th century, although it was not always planned construction. First time I saw the St. Boniface campus, I said, this is really weird. Why am I looking at a 1950s building with an aluminum spire, but there's an 1870s rectory next door and a community building across the way from 1906? And a school from, the 1920s or 30s. Something's really weird going on here, and I kind of figured it out, because that burned down. That is the original St. Boniface Church. Now, I think some of you in the audience may have actually been in this building. Any hands? Yeah, I thought Bob Schnacky had been in this building. That is what was on that campus. It was sort of the south side version of St. Michael's Catholic Church up on Clinton. This is a magnificent example of Gothic revival architecture. A German parish. Those Germans like to build it to make it look like the cathedrals back home. The real tragic story is the fire was the result of a restoration project. For its centennial, they decided to restore the church, and Mr. Roofing Contractor was up on the roof with his torches, and they got kind of out of hand, and the roof caught fire, and then the rest of the church caught fire. And I'd like to get a picture. I don't know what was left. Were there walls left, Bob? I mean, do you remember what survived? It was a huge fire, and obviously they felt it was beyond the ability to reconstruct what we see here. So that's why you have a blonde brick 1950s church building with an aluminum spire. Because of the fire, you lost the centerpiece of that campus. Likewise, the extension of Highland Park south with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Here is the penitentiary where the gentleman was able to dig his way out with a teaspoon. Now, for many years, this is a very interesting building because the center part is like a house, like an Italianate square house with a cupola, and the legendary county sheriff, Albert Skinner, a name many of you maybe recognize or seen, he lived there. That was his residence. The county sheriff lived right at the jail. But that's gone. In the 1970s, your neighborhood did not have a nickname of South Wedge. In fact, there was no such thing. No one ever heard a term. You were what ward were you? Or several wards. 14th Ward, this is how everything in town, if you were realtors, every piece of real estate in the newspaper, you were in the 10th Ward, the 2nd Ward, the 4th Ward, the 25th Ward, whatever. So then, as neighborhoods were getting interested in renovation, and here is one of the early efforts of rehabilitating houses in the South Wedge. In the late 70s and early 1980s, many neighborhoods either brought out of retirement names like Swilberg or Edgerton, or they invented new nicknames like the South Wedge, because if you look at a map, you're kind of wedge-shaped. Looking at downtown, the river, and Clinton Avenue, you sort of like a wedge of a pie. So that's when the nickname South Wedge was adopted, was about 1978 or 9, when you were undergoing this new revitalization. It was very interesting to see, not only were houses renovated, but topless towers were fixed. The top of this tower, the little hat above the brick, actually came from a building out in the town of Webster and was trucked into the neighborhood and with a crane plunked on the top of this house as one of the earliest renovation efforts. It was a very successful, and I doubt if any of you would ever know that this had come from a different building. You could even fool preservation architects, they wouldn't know. You had one of the first elementary schools, former School 13, where Marie Daly had been principal for many years. This was one of the first efforts of taking a defunct elementary school and creating apartments, which it is still today, but it was an experiment and one of the first, and obviously many more have followed. Helen Ellwanger lived almost to her 100th birthday. She was very modest. She did not have a big presence in the community as a headliner like some of the other well-known characters that were in Rochester, but she put her money where her mouth was. She bought the Campbell Whittlesey house and then roped 6 of her friends together to create something called the Society for the Preservation of Landmarks in Western New York, based on the Society of the Preservation of Landmarks New England Antiquities, which is now called Historic New England. She bought Campbell Whittlesey house. She put her money into that. She's kept the garden that her grandfather laid out in 1867 that was continuously cultivated. She hired Fletcher Steele to add other amenities. Those beautiful urns and sort of Art Deco walls that are out here are part of Fletcher Steele, a nationally renowned landscape architect who grew up in Pittsford. Helen founded the Landmark Society, and upon her death gave us this entire property, the house next door, the house you're sitting in, and the garden. We retained the garden as an outdoor museum to show the horticultural legacy of Rochester, New York, and the region. But we do continually, as Bev Gibson is here, it evolves over time. We're very thrilled. We still have George's pear trees going. It's a real challenge to keep pear trees going 140 years. The house next door was finally purchased and renovated as a single-family residence after over 40 years of vacancy. The Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery, one of the most active volunteer groups, they've celebrated 25 years, not only give magnificent tours of Mount Hope Cemetery, they have coordinated a lot of the fundraising efforts and some of the renovation projects, including what you're seeing here, the entirely new slate roof that was put on the North Gatehouse a year ago. You've had exciting renovation in the South Wedge neighborhood. You have a city preservation district at the intersection of South and Gregory, and this is one of the most exciting renovations. The former library and commercial building, the Landmark Society awarded this renovation with one of our merit awards last year. And of course, you have new construction next door. But you can't escape, of all the quadrants of the city, you have this magnificent horticultural legacy. When you drive in and look on Mount Hope Avenue, there's no other vista like this in Monroe County. And it all goes back to this young German and young Irish immigrant who came here and started this legacy of flowering trees, fruit trees, specimen trees, tree peonies, which are not like herbaceous. And yes, you can grow them almost anywhere. Ladies, if you've died for years about having these, they are not exotic. If you've got regular peonies in your yard, you can grow tree peonies. And I have up here for your fun and Linwood Gardens, the great tree peony estate, opens this weekend. Only 3 weekends open to the public. So if you want to go to Linwood, which is like disappearing into the secret garden, the famous children's book, I have instructions and directions up here you can pick up. So We are still seeing changes in the neighborhood. After many years of dormancy, Rosemary Janofsky finally purchased this building. And Rosemary knows this, we thought every time we heard a story about it's about to be sold, we'd sit there and going, well, we'll see. Well, it finally did. And so we were thrilled to see where you're able to sit here in this living room and you'll get to see all the work Rosemary's done. That's been a huge success. We are still awaiting but maybe one of the most challenging projects is still to come, and that is the rebuilding of the Children's Pavilion at the highest point of Highland Park. There has been serious fundraising efforts. I know one individual who gave $10,000 toward this roughly $2 million project. The architecture and engineering drawings are done. There will be an elevator, so you will have handicap access. It will be built of wood and steel. And so now if you're looking at something to be exciting, and we hope in our lifetime this comes to pass, we hope that indeed crowning the hill over the rhododendron valley will be our next big exciting project here in the southeast part of the city, the reconstruction of one of the most beloved structures in the community, the original Children's Pavilion. So now you've had a taste of some of things that have happened over the last 2 centuries in the South Wedge. So when you drive around, I hope you won't become too dangerous drivers, but you will actually look at the many places you may have known for years but hadn't known the exact background of them.